So greetings from the far west of the Hudson River. My name's Andrew Ross. I am the head of learning sports services at Arizona State University in beautiful Tempe. I was walking around earlier and envying the fact that you have leaves on trees, the fact that you have trees. So today I want to talk about a project that's called Circle, and I'll just cut to the chase a little bit in the next slide and let you know what that acronym actually stands for. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the philosophical and structural overview of this particular project. I want to talk a little bit about being Hispanic in Arizona, which is a significantly different proposition than being Hispanic perhaps anywhere else in the country. I'll talk a little bit about and showcase just a few of the projects that students have done within the context of Circle. And I want to talk also not only about Circle as a tool for social justice and the documentation of the Hispanic experience in Arizona, but I also want to talk about areas for potential growth. And these are areas that I would like to suggest to all of you that you can become involved in within the context of the project. So I'll jump right to the last bullet on this slide and let you know that Circle stands for Community Identities and Research Through Collaborative Language Education. It's not quite lucid, but it's not bad in terms of its general complexity and sort of slavish devotion to making a word. It is first and foremost a framework for interinstitutional collaboration. So one of the sine qua non about the Circle project is that it's something that can't really be done well in isolation. It needs to happen between institutions and between students and faculty. It's a project that brings together heritage learners. And is anybody unfamiliar with the term heritage learner in the room? Yay. Okay, at different institutions to sort of look at what it means to be a heritage learner in those given environments and to do some comparative analysis of what it means to be Hispanic in New York as opposed to being Hispanic in Arizona. It involves students engaging actively in research in their own heritage communities and excuse me, and choosing topics that are of interest to them either personally or professionally as subjects for the kinds of work that they'll be doing. Especially we want to be conscious and respectful and engaged in the communities that surround our institutions. Those of you that are at Ivy League institutions are all, I think, familiar with the concept of the bubble, right? Where things happen within the institution, occasionally they happen outside of the institution, but there's this disconnect, the sort of town and gown problem. So this is an attempt as well to sort of move beyond that and get students actively engaged in the communities that surround them. It's a bit different for us at ASU. I'll give you some more context about that in just a moment. So why? And I'll talk about the what in just a minute, so this will all sort of knit together hopefully and make a little bit more sense to you. Stefan Haritos and I conceived of Circle in 2010, and it grew out of our interest in digital storytelling and also in community context for language learning. We want things to be happen not only within the classroom but outside of the classroom. And we particularly want students to be engaged in authentic situations out in their communities where they're using the language, where they're developing new vocabulary and new insights about their heritage language. We wanted to make sure that we were engaging students' interests. So as I mentioned earlier, the projects that you'll see little short titles of in just a little bit are all predicated on the students' individual interests. And for Arizona students who are heritage learners of Spanish, not surprisingly, these tend to take on a focus around social justice issues, what it means to be Hispanic in Arizona, political issues, issues of class, and issues of language use. we wanted also to make sure that this project was open to multiple forms of both production and assessment. And so you'll see a little bit later on that there are different ways to do Hispanidades, or to do Circle. Hispanidades was sort of the root of this particular project. So if I slip and refer to it as Hispanidades, you just read Circle and you'll all be fine. And then finally, this notion of collaboration, the dialogue between students, dialogue between instructors and institutions is critical in all of this. So a little context about Arizona State University. We have design imperatives. Who knew? And all of these are intended to drive the work that we do at Arizona State University. So let me back up and tell you just a little bit about the school. We're a land-grant institution. We have 82,000 students across 4 campuses. We have approximately 8,000 students a semester taking language courses. About 20% of our population are first-generation college students. So it's a significantly different population than those that you may be used to at your particular institutions. But it's one that it's vibrant, it's dynamic, and we feel like we're doing the work that we need to be doing for the communities that we serve. So here are sort of 3 design principles that guide ASU, and this is why Hispanidades Circle is so, see, I did it again, is so important to both the dean, the provost at ASU. It's got a lot of support at upper levels of the administration. So we're all about social embeddedness, we're all about societal transformation, and we really need to be serving the community that we live in. So let's talk just a little bit about being Hispanic in Arizona and sort of what that means. Can you all read the sign with the 9 on it? Everybody kind of see that? Is there anything you notice about it? Where's the Spanish? Yeah, everything is in English, with the exception of the clause about not offering bribes. That's in Spanish. So 90% of Hispanics in Arizona are of Mexican or Mexican-American origin. So it's a much different population than you have here in New York City or in Seattle or Chicago or other places where we've done the Hispanidades project. The growth over the last decade was about 600,000 Hispanic migrants to Arizona. The total population is 1.9 million Hispanics in Arizona, 1.2 million of whom live within the Phoenix metro area. So about 30% of our population is Hispanic in Phoenix metro. Despite some of the political pressure, we are expected to be Hispanic majority in 2027. And let me talk just a little bit about that political environment, because it really does have an impact on the kinds of projects that students tend to do. So in 2006, the state legislature banned ethnic studies in Arizona schools. The premise was that there should be no curriculum that privileges one group of people over another. And so it ended up being a convenient way of getting rid of Hispanic studies within the Tucson school district and most of the other school districts in the state. In 2010, I'm sure you're all familiar with State Bill 1070. Is this ringing any bells? So State Bill 1070 required local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration policy and ask anybody that they came in contact with what their immigration status was. And then if they couldn't prove immigration status, essentially turn them over to the federal authorities for enforcement. So this is the driving while brown problem in Arizona, because all traffic stops became a pretext for turning people over to ICE and to immigration. So there have been a number of other proposals of laws in Arizona that make it a particularly difficult place to be Hispanic. One was to have separate birth certificates for babies born in Arizona, but to parents who were not residents of Arizona and who were Hispanic. So there's a current, a fairly strong current that is anti-Hispanic and anti-immigrant in Arizona. So you kind of understand the context that we're dealing with. So within all of this, what we are trying to do in Circle is engender collaborations between institutions. Those are sort of metastasized Venn diagrams, but you can get an idea of the scope of the collaborations that have happened over the last 5 years. You can see where the connections are being made, and the Venn diagram analogy is kind of important because Circle is set up so that essentially in any class that is roughly congruent in terms of goals and objectives between institutions, you can actually do the project. You can actually do the framework. So you're not sacrificing all of your curriculum to this kind of collaboration, but you can pick moments within the curriculum to interact with your partner institution around questions that are of mutual interest at different levels. So I'll give you an example. We collaborated with Diana Romero's intermediate heritage Spanish class here at upper beginning, I think, low intermediate, advanced beginner heritage language class here at Columbia. All of our students were in their 4th semester of the heritage language track at ASU. So it's a question of adapting tasks and adapting questions to those particular populations in order to be able to do these. The collaborations, the structure of the collaborations is really intended to run below the administrative radar. So this doesn't get down to sharing curricula back and forth, having to deal with payments in kind or tuition exchange. It's something that is arranged between faculty and carried out within a particular classroom or a particular program. So it's actually easy to start up and to implement a Circle project even outside of the language classroom. So those of you that are in social sciences or history, those of you that are dealing with communities, this is also something that you can do in conjunction with colleagues at other institutions. So the unlabeled little Venn diagrams are a new collaboration that's taking place. At some point, I would like to present on this project and have it look like a bubblegum machine, right? So Duke University, in the persons of Joan Manet and Liliana Paredes, are actually working with George Mason University, University of Houston, and most interestingly, the Universidad de las Americas in Puebla, Mexico, looking at the social and cultural situation and linguistic situation of retornados. These are people who have been either expelled or have voluntarily left the United States and find themselves back in a country that they are allegedly from, but have not necessarily much experience with, either linguistically or culturally. So this is going to be a really fascinating project to watch, and we'll make sure that the results from this project are disseminated along with Circle. So what do students actually do? I know you've been asking yourself that question in between, what kind of sandwiches do we have? So students plan and carry out a research project in a barrio or another community location. They engage in ethnographic research. So they're actually out there doing field work, interviews. These can range from interviewing elders in the community to artists. We had one student drive all the way to Yuma, which is 180 miles, to interview somebody who worked as an agricultural worker, to get that person's perspective and to be able to report that back. They engage broadly with the community. So in the ASU model, there is a service learning component. So we have students who are actually going out, We work with Chicanos por la Causa, which is a sort of clearinghouse for social services in the Phoenix metro area, and students have to do 20 hours of community service within the context of the class. It's a really good way to avoid the kind of superficiality that sometimes you see with surveys where students are dropped off in a neighborhood and told to report back in a couple of days, and they really don't get much beyond the stereotypes that we kind of want to work against. Outcomes can be really different. So at ASU, these are digital stories. These are miniature documentaries. They're typically 6 to 7 minutes long. The student chooses the topic area. They are in the target language. And there's a whole writing process behind that, which is also really important. So in heritage classes, and I won't belabor the point, you really want to get students to be able to deal with a variety of language registers. And so there's the academic register, of course, but there's also persuasive and expository registers of language that this kind of project helps facilitate. It's back to this notion of 21st century communication. How do we communicate? We don't necessarily do it by writing academic essays. We do it by creating narratives that are compelling and sustained and coherent. And so that's really sort of the writing and linguistic part of this project. So the advantages, some of these I've already mentioned, so I'll elide them relatively quickly. Each course involved in Circle retains its own curriculum and its own instruction. You don't have to give up everything that you're doing in order to participate. I can't emphasize that enough. Administrative complexities really come down to deciding on a third space, usually technologically mediated, where students can come together and share those things that don't need to be private, like, so grades obviously would be a problem, but the kinds of dialogues and posts that students tend to do, there has to be a third space for. So it's really communication between the instructors that becomes critical. Collaboration can occur at different points in the respective curricula. So we've worked with institutions that are on the quarter system. So we end up doing it at the beginning of our semester and the end of their quarter, or vice versa. So as long as there's coordination between the faculty member, this can happen almost any time during the course schedule. Collaboration between institutions, we've found, is absolutely key to the success of Circle, right? Students, especially our students, need to gain broader perspectives on what it means to be Hispanic or Chinese or South Asian in different contexts, and to be able to relate that to their own experience comparatively. Students who are dealing with other students have a much stronger motivation to communicate. This is not just a dialogue with the instructor. It's not a dialogue with classmates. It's real communication where negotiation of meaning occurs. Research can be tailored to student ability levels. So for the more advanced students, you can do really, really interesting things that go way beyond la comida del barrio, and talk about issues of social justice. And we even had, I'll talk about a project in which students actually got into city council records to see why decisions had been made that disenfranchised the Hispanic community. It's also a gateway. The idea is that we want students to continue this kind of research, this sort of autonomous, motivated learning and writing about their communities just as a means of continued engagement in their society, in their communities. So we can talk about a few different topics. If anybody recognizes the two calaveras in the top left corner, you can raise your hand and I'll give you my sandwich at lunch. So topics range from, sort of the very broad social justice and discrimination. We had students who worked on universal Spanish at Univision Phoenix. They actually interviewed newscasters to find out what variety of Spanish they were using and why, and how it differed from sort of regular Spanish, which I thought was a really interesting topic. El Barrio Viejo de Tucson, Yerberias, which are sort of botanicas for the New York among you, right? So alternative medicine, mispronunciation as dishonesty. So we had a student look at how Spanish speakers modify their pronunciation when they're speaking to Anglos and what that actually means. I thought that was kind of a fascinating topic. Linguistic and cultural barriers for people of Guatemalan origin in Metro Phoenix. Remember, that's a tiny minority for us. So what happens to those folks? And the two sides of surprise, and this is one that I want to talk about just briefly. I've got about 2 minutes. I'm almost done. So Surprise is a community in the northern valley of the sun, right? And it's largely split between Anglo and Hispanic populations, but over the course of the years, decisions have been made about where funds are allocated. And typically those funds get allocated to the Anglo side of town. And so two students decided that they wanted to look at the public record to see who had made these decisions, why the decisions were made, whether there was input from the Hispanic community about any of these decisions, and it turns out that there wasn't much. So I talked a little bit about this at Yale in February, and a bunch of hands went up saying, Title VI violation, Title VI violation, and they're not wrong. So I really look at this particular project, particularly for the Hispanic community, but not exclusively, as a vehicle for documenting issues of social justice in Arizona, which is badly in need of this kind of thing. So you have topics, but you also have their afterlife. So where do these things go to live? All of the writing and the documentary making within Circle has an afterlife. We regard these as micro-publications. Students are producing these for a larger audience, not just for the faculty member, and not just for each other. So there's a site, we're getting a lot of congruence here, right, around mapping and stories. There's a really strong sub-theme running through all of these presentations, and I don't know if it was deliberate or not. I think it just happened. So at ASU, we have the School of Historical, Political, and Religious Studies, which manages a set of WordPress sites running software called CurateScape, not Cityscape. And these essentially allow mapping of stories onto territory. It's not very different than the kind of thing that the people are doing here at the LRC. So the beauty of this is that the stories, the documentaries in Spanish get folded into Salt River Stories, which is the sort of the wider set of narratives around the Valley of the Sun, so Phoenix and Tempe, most of which are in English. So what we're actually doing is we're inserting a linguistic and cultural presence into this publication space that wasn't there before. So finally, for us, community research and service leads to community understanding, right? For heritage learners, particularly, this gives them an opportunity to communicate with members of their community, and because we are building language skills, they're more capable of sustained critical analysis of the kinds of discourse that happen in their communities. They're able to sort of translate it into the surrounding, I'm going to say host language, but I don't really mean host language, right? The surrounding other language and culture. And it allows us to document, I think, in really interesting and meaningful ways, both language and lived experience over time. So just as I said, I wanted the slide with the Venn diagrams to look like a bubblegum machine at some point. I'd like that map to look entirely covered all over the United States with circle stories. So we've done this for Spanish. Why not for Chinese? Why not for Hindi? So these are some of the next steps that we're thinking about. So we've already moved at ASU from heritage only to L2 heritage combined classes. There are some issues with this. I spoke a little bit about them. So when you have people that aren't familiar with the culture, dropping them into that particular environment and expecting them to comment more than superficially can be problematic at times. Circle has in fact become its own course at ASU. There's good and bad to this, and we can talk about that during discussion. It's being used in content courses as a means of cultural documentation. So one of our graduate students went on to the University of Wyoming, and she uses these techniques in a Chicano literature and culture course, where students are actually going out into the Laramie, Wyoming community, not a hotbed of Hispanic culture, but looking at the kinds of spaces and the kinds of characters that they're reading about in their novels and trying to make connections between what's around them and what they're actually reading. We're working with the Chinese language flagship at ASU to fold Circle into their preparation for abroad experience. So we're having students who are in Fujian or in other places in China doing their year experience essentially documented. So what does it mean to be, in this case, a foreigner in China? What are the cultural imperatives? What are the pitfalls? And then we're also talking about expanding this to other continents. So this could be Paris. We've had some discussion with Paris 12, but also with Roehampton University in the UK about looking at these communities across Europe. And I don't think I have to tell anybody about sort of the political or social implications of communities of language and culture embedded in larger societies and the issues that come with that. So finally, we don't do this all on our own. Steve, Bill Kolopoulos, who's no longer with us, he's not dead, he's at Middlebury. Diana Romero, lots of people at ASU, University of Washington, Cal State University San Marcos, and finally some folks at the University of Illinois Chicago. And thank you for your patience. I know it's almost lunch.